there's two sides to every coin. Then there's a conversation you can join. But I'm an old dog and there's new tricks. And some of my opinions you just can't fix. 'Cause I'm an old man yelling at the sky. I'ma shake my fists at the clouds and cry. Get off my lawn, you snowflake, before I have a meltdown, breakdown, shakedown. 'Cause this is my hometown, so back down, sports clown. It's all just a game, and it's the last down, let down, cowtown. I said it's all just a game. I give the touchdown, the rundown, the lowdown. 'Cause it's over the game, gonna crack down and shut down the sundown. I said it's all just a game.
Hello, kids. Welcome to Just a Game. I would be your host, Rob Kerr. You would be you. Welcome in. It's been a while. I feel like I haven't been. Well, I did a show last Friday, but then it was a long weekend, and now this, and I was gone for a couple. So it's nice to be back. Not quite the regular routine. We will return to 3 days a week starting October 4th with the first Wednesday show of the new season. But until then, Mondays and Fridays, we got you. We're back on Monday, back next Friday. Lots to talk about today. Coming up a little later on in the program, Adam Seaborn will join us. Adam, of course, our sports business analyst, sports media analyst. A lot to talk about. A huge announcement by the CRTC this week that is going to impact the way you view sports. So we'll get into that. Also, Adam has identified some pretty huge trends as we get going here into the fall. And it is the fall. I mean, well, technically not. That's a week or two, but it's beginning to be a little cooler. But we are now officially into the NFL season. Last night, we saw the Detroit Lions winning on the road against Kansas City. So the NFL season's underway. CFL is now post-Labor Day. The Stamps up in Edmonton on Saturday. Good opportunity for Calgary to put some breathing room between themselves and the Eskimos. Or the Eskimos to reel the Stamps back in. However, playoff positioning is beginning to kind of perhaps drift away from both clubs. So a big game nonetheless. The Jays find themselves back close to occupying a playoff spot, if not occupying the third and final wild card spot. So just a couple of weeks left in that season. And, of course, the National Hockey League. The Flames will begin rookie camp, I believe, next week. Penticton, I think, is a week from today, or the weekend Young Stars tournament, main camp right after that. Suffice to say, we are closing in on a month away from the start of the regular season. So as kids go back to school, as kids start playing hockey again, as they start playing basketball again, as we start into our routines of the fall and winter, a lot to cover, a lot to talk about today. Want to touch on a couple things. Last week when we spoke, which was on Friday, by the way, this is an inclusive podcast. Everybody's welcome here. And we are broadcasting live from Treaty 7 territory. And I mentioned that the Calgary Hitmen open up their Western Hockey League preseason schedule out at Siksika tonight. So out in Gleason at the Deerfoot Sportsplex. So that has become somewhat of a tradition that I think is really cool. As well, had the opportunity last week with Mike Civic to march in the Pride Parade representing the Flames alumni, which I thought was really, really cool too. So a lot going on, a lot of just lots to be around and a lot to talk about. When we spoke last, this is where I was going. When we spoke last, we were talking about Bill Peters and his hiring by the Lethbridge Hurricanes and the Western Hockey League. And there was 48 hours, maybe 72 hours of concern and stories and back and forth. And then we came back on the scene, a little late to the table, but still had some thoughts on it. I don't think anything has changed. I don't think anybody's opinion has moved. Life goes on. Teams are having training camp. I think the reality is Bill Peters and the Western Hockey League and everybody involved knew that they had to take some lumps for a couple of days, and then it would all go away, and everybody would forget about it until something happens or something else comes up or whatever. With that kind of as a backdrop, interesting that today two separate things are happening in the hockey world that, if you think about it, are rather related. Hockey has, in this country particularly, has taken some lumps and some black eyes just for its tone deafness, its inability to act, its institutionalism. It started somewhat early last night, and then again this morning, questions being raised to the National Hockey League about the ongoing investigation of the 2018 World Junior team. And there's no update on that. But two different events are taking place at the same time and deserve to be viewed and scrutinized and asked, what they're doing, what the value is. Is there value here? In Chicago, the NHL is holding a general managers coaches meeting. I don't remember this before, but maybe there has been. But what was interesting about this, and Mark Lazarus, who covers the Chicago Blackhawks for The Athletic, brought this up. Joel Quenneville and Stan Bowman are both at this event put on by the National Hockey League. Both gentlemen, because of the situation that the Blackhawks found themselves in, the terrible situation the Blackhawks found themselves in, both gentlemen have been taken away from hockey, are not allowed to come back to the National Hockey League at this point. They spoke to the general managers and the coaches. Gary Bettman, speaking to Mark Lazarus, was asked specifically what the two talked about. And I thought Bettman's answer was not surprising. I still have to make a judgment as to when or whether it's appropriate for them to be reinstated. So that's not a question I'm prepared to answer right now. But he did mention that both were there voluntarily and to share their experiences. It strikes me as the National Hockey League is building a path to return for both individuals, and part of their comeuppance is that they have to stand in front of their peers and tell why they were bad and naughty. I shouldn't make light of it. It's not a funny situation, but it does strike me as, okay, this is what, the National Hockey League is going to ask of these two gentlemen. Here in Calgary, Hockey Canada, who has bore quite the brunt of criticism and responsibility for a lot of issues that have come up in sport and in hockey in the last number of years. A part of they have a new president and a board, which is only their current board is, I believe, limited to 1 year term. They have an event today called the Beyond the Board Summit. It's actually today and tomorrow. It is up at WinSport. The agenda has been available for a couple of weeks. Sheldon Kennedy's one of the speakers. There's some fairly significant people at that event. I did have the opportunity to speak to somebody on the board. This is the start of a series of these summits, that there will be other topics. Toxic masculinity is the main thrust of the next 2 days at Hockey Canada. I've also heard from people inside the sport at the grassroots level that don't know anything about it. We're not invited to be there. This seems to be for sponsors and media, which begs the question is, okay, is this an opportunity for Hockey Canada to win back its sponsors and the people that have been funding it, or are they, truly making change? I think the people that they brought on board would truly like to make change. I just don't know if the institution of hockey is prepared to make that change. So both of these things going on at the same day is fascinating to me, that it's a sport that is grappling with who and what and where it fits. I said this last week about Bill Peters. The problem with the Bill Peters situation, the problem with the situation in the NHL, and the problem that Hockey Canada find themselves in is that there are many on the one side, on the hockey side, that think this is all made up, that think this is the media and some fanatic fans or public trying to hold them, hostage, and they really don't know what's going on. And there's a little blame the victim, and there's a little of this and there's a little of that. That kind of thinking still plagues the sport. Sorry, it just does. I think there are plenty of people that want to make true change. I have yet to see this sport want to make true change. The sport does a really good job of talking about making true change, but the sport, I don't think, has really done enough to make change. This is a snarky comment, but it's how I know a lot of people feel about this. This was a great opportunity to print off really fancy folders with embossed logos on them, and everybody can get a really nice set of pens, and we'll have really nice paper, and we'll have drinks of and coffee and that. But at the end of the day, what's really going to be accomplished? I don't know. And I hope I am wrong. I hope that both of these events lead to substantial change. But I would suggest to you right now that hockey is kind of trying to find its way in this world and where it fits. And unless it's prepared to make true change, unless it's truly prepared to look upon itself and ask hard questions, I don't know. This just in many ways kind of feels like, one exercise is to try and rehab the reputations of Joel Quenneville and Stan Bowman. And on the other half, I hope that this is more than Hockey Canada just trying to show that its potential sponsors and current sponsors that it's changing its ways. It has to lead to substantive change. One last bitchy thing, and then we'll get to our guest. And my bitchy thing is about the Heritage Classic. It's coming up, I believe it's Sunday, October 29th, up in Edmonton, which was the host of the first Heritage Classic. I have long been a proponent and a fan of the outdoor game. I think outdoor games are awesome. I think outdoor games are celebrations. I think outdoor games help to grow the sport, and it needs to grow north of the border. I don't care what anybody says. We have to be selling the sport and growing the sport north of the border. What disappoints me here, and why I'm beginning to fall into the other camp, is it's a NHL game and that's it. No alumni game, no Western League game, no U Sports game, no women's game, no kids games, hell, no media game. It's just a straight hockey game. And there's Connor McDavid. And this is really feeling like we better get Connor McDavid an outdoor game. Now, I think he's already played in one, but this is an outdoor game at home. It's really disappointing to me that the National Hockey League, and I truly believe this is the league. I don't think this is the teams at all. I could be proven wrong, but I think the league particularly concerns itself with ice conditions and all of those sort of things, because it gets criticized when the conditions aren't great. It really does. But I think this is one of those circumstances where they've dropped the ball. I think just having it's just another hockey game. This one's outdoors. There's no feel to it. The Heritage Classic in Regina had a Western League game attached to it. It was a 2-day thing. It was a festival. And I'm sure there's going to be festival elements, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of people there. And I'm sure Oiler fans and Flames fans will dig the game and everything like that. But it just seems like a missed opportunity to not grow the game. And again, as someone who has defended outdoor games constantly, to me, it was always about, being able to build on it. But it needed to be more about the community, and it needed to be more about the sport. This one just feels like we ought to get Connor McDavid a home outdoor game before he moves on. And I'm not saying he's going anywhere. Whatever you do, don't interpret that. All right. That's my bitchiness. That's my snarkiness. That's me just, again, holding hockey accountable. Good Lord knows it can be better. All right. Our first guest, our only guest today, because he's the only one we need, is brought to you by Ski Cellar Snowboard. SkiCellarSnowboard.com, 77 years in Calgary. 3 locations open right now. McLeod Trail by Chinook Center, 17th Avenue Southwest, just off of 14th Street, and Bow Ridge Road Northwest by McDonald's at the bottom by Winsport. So open right now. Get in there. Check them out. Online as well, but it's the service that's going to make the difference here. These are people that are serving you, are also up in the mountains using the same equipment that you're going to buy. So you're getting it from the people who use it, and there is value in that. SkiCellarSnowboard.com. Very excited that our next guest can make some time for us, as he always has. He is a sports media analyst and also the head of partnerships at Playmaker Capital. He's our friend. He's our pal. Adam Seaborn joins us today. Adam, how are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you doing, Rob?
I am really good. Boy, you really set the table on Tuesday with a couple of really important tweets. So I want to jump right in on both of them. And I kind of promoted your segment with, a very significant story in Canada that's going to affect the way people watch things, and particularly to watch sports. And that is the CRTC decision on Tuesday. Can you just run us through what it means now that they've taken the shackles off the advertisement per hour limit?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me on again, Rob. It's good to chat. So this is an interesting development, I would say. People know the CRTC is the regulatory body that, their mandate is a combination of regulating the radio, television, communications, hence the CRTC name, business, and also protecting consumers. Protecting consumers is a big part of their mandate, making sure, advertisement on television or radio is, abiding by rules and regulations, and the Canadians are not being kind of, victim of predatory type advertising. CRTC is responsible for things like 10, 15 years ago, companies like Verizon wanted to come into Canada and buy up a bunch of bandwidth and buy a bunch of TV stations and networks. They stopped that because CRTC mandates that you need to be a Canadian company to operate that kind of stuff. One of the stipulations, and there's all kinds of really specific rules around what you can and can't say on radio and television in Canada. Rob, working in
Yep.
traditional media for a long time, and your listeners will know, when you listen to the radio station, you hear the call sign and the call letters, that's a mandated thing. CRTC says that you need to say that a certain amount of times. One of the big mandated items they had was with respect to cable television. In Canada, it's usually called specialty TV in the regulation, but for all intents and purposes, cable, think TSN, History Channel, is advertising limits per hour. So typically or historically, the rule was 12 minutes per hour clock of advertising time. So, usually television sold in 30-second chunks. So think of it as 24 30-second advertisements per hour. That's what you would get on TV. Quebecor, which owns TVA, came to the CRTC essentially requesting that we remove that limit. It's, limits their ability to compete with streaming services was their argument. There's no regulatory kind of framework for YouTube or for Netflix or for anyone else. And we believe that, like, when it comes to paid cable, this is not broadcast, so not CBC, not CTV, stuff like that, but paid cable channels, we should be able to advertise, any limit that we want. We want to remove that limit. And Bell and not Rogers, but Bell and Chorus also submitted kind of support for Quebecor's request and said, yes, we would, 100% agree with this request, and we would like to, kind of endorse it. And the CRTC, effective immediately as of Tuesday, ruled in favor of Quebecor, said, you know what, we agree with you. You should be able to advertise as much as you like. So the Broadcasting Act will be slightly amended to reflect that. And it means that you will be able to advertise more than 12 minutes per half hour. How that's going to change viewership for us is interesting, right? So the removal of the limit doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to all of a sudden have a huge ad load on TV, but it does provide flexibility for the broadcasters in terms of how they look at ad loads. And frankly, it just opens up a bunch more inventory for them, right? Imagine you're in a business and you only had a finite amount of inventory to sell. You're an airline. You only have 100 seats on the plane. We just added a bunch more seats that you're allowed to sell. You've added more minutes to sell. And, no doubt programming at all those networks are working on where can we find more advertising time. You might not notice it as a consumer, but in the ad market, all the ad agencies and in the broadcast world, it's a big story. And it's definitely, a change that I don't think people were expecting. I was kind of surprised when Quebecor made the request. It seemed somewhat frivolous. I don't think the connection between what the streaming services do and the way advertising per hour is mandated on TV. I don't really buy that connection, to be honest.
Okay.
And here we are. So it's an interesting change, and we'll see how it feels, as we move into the fall programming here.
Well, and I'm glad you said that piece at the end, because that was my follow-up question. So explain to me what they're talking about, because as I read it, and you made a really good example, which is if you look at TSN and Sportsnet right now, they have a lot of those highlight programs, right, that are 30-minute blocks. Now you can make those 60-minute blocks. By doing that, it's not real math, but you almost need half the content that you currently have, which again, we constantly talk about the lack of content. I just don't see how the consumer comes out on the better end of this.
Well, I'll make the argument that the broadcasters will say, listen, it's a new world. The Broadcasting Act is outdated, which is very true. I think there's a lot of problems with the Broadcasting Act.
Yep.
And this is, going to provide us with more flexibility in how we schedule programming, and we'll be able to provide, more flexible ad loads depending on demand, the same way that, YouTube or Google or Facebook and Meta kind of ingest demand for advertising and then distribute that demand across their platform. So they would make that argument and say this is just a step in the right direction of modernizing the way that we broadcast things. I mean, the reality is exactly what I mentioned. People who aren't on Twitter, I guess we're calling it X now.
Yeah.
Right now I'm in Toronto. I'm in Eastern time. It's 3:20. If you turn on TSN or you turn on Sportsnet, I think Sportsnet on every channel was playing an equestrian competition of some kind earlier today.
Yep.
You'll often see plays of the week, top 50 CFL plays of all time, highlight shows. These are packaged shows that, frankly, are not revenue drivers for the channel, right? So you have a channel. Part of your obligation as having a broadcast channel is you need to program it. You need to program it with a certain amount of Canadian content per hour and per day as well. So those highlight shows very neatly they're low cost. You already have all the highlights. They hit your CanCon requirements. And they just run during the day when, frankly, not that many people are watching, and then you sell really cheap advertising time against it. What you've done now is create an opportunity where you can just pile in a little bit more of that cheap advertising time midday.
Right.
And as I mentioned, like that half-hour highlight show can be an hour highlight show with twice the ads. I wouldn't be surprised if we see that. I wouldn't be surprised if the show that used to be 50 plays of the week that took an hour takes 2 hours.
What about sports programming? What about intermissions? What about, half times and things like that? And I would use Sportsnet as an example. When they started with their NHL package, they had all kinds of, panelists and segments and things like that. And now they're down to usually 2 talking heads, and some highlights. Is it possible that they may take advantage of this and just start piling ads into period intermissions?
Yeah, I think pre and post game for sure.
Okay.
There is some flexibility in the Broadcasting Act for live events. So
Gotcha.
Sports and news already had a kind of carve out there. So there's people who might be saying 12 minutes per hour. I could have sworn I saw more than 12 minutes of advertising per hour when I was watching, CP24, when I was watching, Sportsnet recently. There was already a carve out where they were allowed to flex depending on when they were covering something that's live. So sports and news.
Yep.
So I think we might have more advertising in game. I think that's true. You look at Major League Baseball or the NFL or, CFL, whatever league it is, there are already kind of structured ad breaks that the league decides, hey, the advertising breaks happen here. If you've been to an NHL game, all of a sudden the red light goes on in the penalty box. That means it's a TV timeout. So there's already kind of a structure from the leagues for the most part of how much advertising time happens in game. But I think your point is right. Everything outside of the quote unquote in game is up for debate. I mean, TSN and Sportsnet are not under any obligation to have an intermission show, to be honest, right? Between the first and second intermission, if they wanted to, the game could end and it could run. I'm not sure how long an NHL intermission is these days. I would say 15 minutes.
18 minutes.
18 minutes. So you could run 18 minutes of advertising. You could. They could do that if they wanted to. I think the league would be pretty upset with them. And I think obviously fans would be pretty pissed, but you could do that if you wanted to. I don't know if we're getting quite there, but we certainly are steering away from, as you mentioned, how much shoulder content is being produced by the big networks. They are really getting out of the business, in my opinion, of non-game content. If you look at Sportsnet and TSN from 10 years ago to today, and if you look at ESPN and other networks in the US as well, I mean, there used to be a lot more things like on TSN, the Sports Reporters, which was a Canadian version of the Reporters.
Yep.
There was, numerous shows like Michael Landsberg's show. There were, Tim and Sid for a long time on Sportsnet, then Tim and Friends. There were so many of these kind of, shoulder programming shows that were meant to inform people, kind of that like news editorial type, outside the lines-esque type, like what they do in ESPN. Those shows have all shut down. Outside the Lines is done in the U.S. Brian Gumbel's HBO show announces its final season. If you look at, Sportsnet and TSN today, outside of in-game broadcasts, there is very little editorial going into TV. I mean, I have a hard time, again, morning Sports Center or Sportsnet Central Loop is one thing, highlight packs. But again, beyond those two, it's generally non-existent. I mean, you syndicate radio shows. Overdrive's probably the top talk TV show on TSN, and it's a radio show. It's not a TV show.
I'm glad you brought up Outside the Lines and Real Sports, because I put out a tweet a couple of days ago when those both got canceled at the same day. It was almost like the death of that lane of journalism in sports. It really worries me, because they did those shoulder programs, as you called them, had a purpose. And, it wasn't necessarily to draw eyeballs, but it was to draw attention. And now, I think now about, how important Rick Westhead is in this entire country, because outside of him, where is the reporting? Who's keeping sport accountable anymore? And they've just kind of done away with it. I'm not sure we're better off without those programs. Yeah.
I mean, if you look around Canada right now and you look in the traditional media, not to get too doom and gloom, because I do think there is like an emergence of new media coming up that, we can get optimistic about, but who are the sports reporters out there? There are very few employed reporters. I mean, I think of a handful at Post Media, and Post Media's had a lot of challenges financially, and they're not investing in more sports reporting. The Globe and Mail has generally only covered Canadian press or wire stories. There's the occasional, opinion piece from Cathal Kelly, but not exactly a sports section. I mean, you look at the Star, which has kind of the most robust sports section, which is very, very thin. And then you go to the TV networks, and as you mentioned, outside of Rick Westhead, there's very few people. There's no editorial page on Sportsnet's website anymore, neither TSN's. And I think that very few of the people there would consider themselves sports journalists. I mean, I'm not sure who at TSN besides Rick Westhead would say that I'm a sports journalist. You have analysts, you have former players like a Jeff O'Neill or Jamie McLennan. You have hosts like James Duthie. You have Sports Center hosts like Lindsay Hamilton. There's lots of great hosts, but who else there considers themselves a journalist? And that's Sportsnet, Arash Madani. Perhaps.
Yeah,
I'm not sure who else.
Yeah, and Arash and Rick aren't the same thing either.
No,
right? Arash is the last of the old school travels the world, covers sports guys, and Westhead's the last of the real good, investigative reporters. I think they have the likes of Dave Naylor and Chris Johnston and I guess an Elliot Friedman, but Friedman's more of an insider than a reporter.
I would consider Chris Johnston an insider, like
would
an
you?
Elliot Friedman or like a Frank Seravalli. I mean, are they? I don't know if they. The question is identification. Like, what would they call themselves? I don't think Elliot would call himself a journalist.
No,
although he has like kind of roots in journalism. Like a lot of people on air, but the next crop certainly not. I mean, I think that reporting is just no longer the way that we think about sports content creation. And I think it's all goes back to like kind of this, migration in terms of how we talk and think about sports. The quote unquote fanalist is now the model, right? The hyper, kind of opinionated, open about who they root for, which you never used to do.
Oh God, no.
Type of on-air personality. And then you have the straight play-by-play and color guys, right? You have that kind of traditional stuff. So, I mean, to your point, when you look at what's on television with Sportsnet and TSN, outside of the broadcast, I don't think that they're investing or very interested in being in the conversation for sport outside of broadcasting games. I think that they know the money is made in the games. That's what people are there for. It's the only reason to really consume legacy media is for when it comes to sport, that is to watch the broadcast of the games. I mean, say what you will about streaming and second streams and the Manning cast and things like that. If you want to watch the Leaf game on Saturday night, you have to go to Sportsnet or CBC, and if you want to watch the Oilers game, you're going to have your TV package or a streaming version of it. And you're going to have to essentially watch TV for whatever that's worth. But everything else outside of watching the game is better served in another medium. I think between podcast, blogs, social, Reddit, Discord channels, there's so many better ways to have all the auxiliary experience of being a sports fan that really TSN and Sportsnet, they're not in that business. That's just not what they do.
Yeah. Let me ask you this one. Do you believe that I think you and I've had this conversation. I think we've got off track with news and sports in the sense that we've tied ratings to it and we've tied clicks to it and we tied all of that. That if we took that part out of it and we just now we have news and sports really tailored for the individual, right? How do you want to hear it? How do you want to consume it? Should there be some sort of government or state? And I know I'm not talking about the CBC, but
yeah.
But I'm really worried that if we don't have reporters covering sports and asking critical questions, that we're going to end up with more Hockey Canada scandals and more Soccer Canada scandals. And I just don't know where that comes from. And I don't see that responsibility being taken by the big two. Do we need to look at, local investing in local journalism and having those kind of projects propped up and taken out of having to survive on ratings and clicks? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand. So it's actually interesting conversation. I'll plug another show. David Hurley has his air quotes media is his media network. David Hurley, totally different, non-sports related, political network where, Canadian politics shows. They had a roundtable talking about Bill C-18 and effect on Canadian news and publishing. And this very question came up. Should there be some kind of government created, but not just supporting big corporations, which frankly has happened lots, right? The government has bailed out all the big guys in the past, but a government kind of created a press corps for politics in Canada. And should there just be like a baseline of a press that we say, hey, Ottawa needs to be covered or accountability doesn't happen and there's going to be corruption. The government needs to have an arm's length relationship with this, obviously, but not quite like the CBC, but something like that. There needs to be a government funded. Does the same exist for sport? I mean, in their conversation, sport didn't come up, but I think it's a very, for our purposes, because it's what a lot of people will focus on. I think it's an interesting conversation. And I do think that there might be a role for that. I think we do a very bad job of supporting, local media in Canada. And when I mean media, I mean everything from, again, like someone within a TikTok page to Post Media to TSN to Bell. I think we do a bad job of supporting local. And I think the government could do a much better job of creating incentives for that. Now, getting away from the idea of ratings and clicks, this is where I think there's been a little bit of a reckoning with how the news business has always operated. And, going back to there, I think that a lot of people are nostalgic for the good old days. I don't know if there were good old days when it comes to traditional media. There were newspapers that were making lots of money, but if you actually peeled back the onion a little bit, you'd see that a lot of the money they were making were because people were buying the sports section or because of classifieds, and that not that many people were actually paying for journalism. And you start stripping away some of these, revenue generators from traditional media, and traditional media was left alone. Sports media, same thing. I mean, as much as, people like Rick Westhead and all the great reporting that happened in sport on television, how many people were, subscribing to TSN or Sportsnet because they want to watch the game? They didn't care at all about the shoulder programming, but there was so much money going around that they could invest in, this kind of altruistic journalist type attitude. I think, today, what is the business model? Does someone want to pay for investigation? It's very difficult to draw the line. And I don't, the Athletic tried to do that. You look at the Athletic today. Yeah. I mean, I would say it's too bad. The Athletic promised us, this phenomenal local journalism, and it's going to be digital. It's going to be ad free, which I don't think really matters if it's ad free or not, but they didn't make that promise. There's advertising now. And if you go to the Athletics page, there's maybe one story about the Blue Jays this last week. They're not covering it. And it's true for many other sports. And, their subscription price is down so much because they're having a hard time getting people to pay with it. It's now bundled as part of the New York Times. So I don't know if there is a model out there where people want to pay for investigative journalism, but we do know that people will pay, and they'll pay more for, the content we described earlier, this kind of fanalist type content. People will pay for that. And there is a business there.
Yeah.
So I think it's incumbent on the new media companies that emerge. Anyone from, listen, the Nation Network that you're broadcast on today, that, Disclosure Playmaker is the owner of, and
Yep.
people like, as bad as some people think about Barstool Sports, people like Barstool Sports who are successful, profitable, new digital sports media companies that are playing in the kind of entertainment of sports business. I think it's incumbent on them to also be part of the journalism discourse.
I absolutely, I agree. And I think where we're going to end up here is in a conversation about media literacy. Mm-hmm. And, do we teach media literacy in schools? And by media literacy, it's understanding that, you're the same way as I am, I'm sure. Whatever you see on Twitter, whatever you see on whatever you read, my mind goes immediately to, okay, where's the second, where's I need to get, mm-hmm. I need this vetted, right? I need to find another source. Okay, this sounds too good to be true. Yeah, here it is. It's media literacy. And I think we live in a world that is media illiterate. That people want to read what they want to read. We saw that during the pandemic. We lived that. And I think there's an element of sports with that, but sports is entertainment, so that's okay. Barstool Sports is not my thing. Dan Patrick is my thing. That's okay. We have those options. What worries me is that we had significant damage done in our sports, in our grassroots sports, and in our NGOs, and it was only found out by reporting. And I don't know if 10 years from now, Adam, that reporting exists. And I'm not the old man, get off my lawn, don't look at your phone guy, but I do value that. And I wonder where it could exist in this world.
I agree. I share your concern. I mean, I do think that it is a national embarrassment that pretty much every sports organization within Canada, every NSO is ripe with corruption,
right?
Or mismanagement, if not corruption,
yeah.
right? And who are the people holding them accountable is a question.
Who's watching the watchers?
Exactly.
Right?
Now, I will take an optimistic spin in that. I do think that there are enormous media companies being birthed out of this, and that there are, TikTok in my mind didn't exist 2 years ago. Now, I bet you if you went to a high school and asked people where they saw their sports highlights, their answer would be TikTok. I bet you that's where they got their sports news. I bet you that's where they get a lot of news. I bet you that's where they found out that, that Josh Sanderson signed a big deal with the Senators. If you're in Ottawa, at the high school in Ottawa, that's probably the first place that they saw it. So, is there someone who's going to have an investigative journalism type of beat and business built off a social following? There are people in the news space that are doing this, right? Mm-hmm. So hard news in the US, there are a number of examples. I hate to use Tucker Carlson as one because I don't think he's hard news or anything. But he left traditional media on Fox, and he still has a voice and is doing interviews and is doing so independently and digitally. There's nothing stopping from that continuing to happen. Now, he's not really investigative, and Tucker Carlson's got a lot of other issues going on, so maybe the worst example you could use. But the point is that despite being taken out of the legacy media ecosystem, he's able to continue doing what he does. I think that there's opportunity for investigative journalism without the backing of a traditional media company. I don't think you need to be have the National Post or the TSN letterhead to investigate NSOs and to ask hard questions and to find out what's going on with the management of sport.
I agree. I guess the other thing I think it boils down to is context. And we need, as much as, yes, we can adapt to the new formats, but can we get context into the shorter, the smaller, the shrinking attention span, right? You mentioned TikTok. Nobody's going to watch a 10-minute TikTok, right?
Well, it's an interesting point. I would say that no one's going to watch a 10-minute TikTok, but that the largest sports podcast in Quebec is a show called La Poche Bleue with Maxime Lapierre and Guillaume Latendresse, which, again, full disclosure, we added to our network recently, so I will plug them a little bit.
Okay.
If you go to YouTube and watch episode 1 of this season, their broadcast is 4.5 hours on YouTube. The watch time.
No. And trust me, given the opportunity, Jack and I would do 4.5 hours here too.
But my point is that they do 4.5 hours. Now they love doing it, but they do it because their audience engages for that long. Yes. And you look at the biggest sports podcast in the world, something like Part of My Take, that is a multi-hour long show. So I push back with the attention span argument a little bit. I think that there's room for both. I think that the kind of like TikTok, Instagram Reels short hit is part of the equation for younger, audience members and younger sports fans and younger, news consumers.
Yeah.
But I think they also have an appetite. There's a reason that podcasting is booming. Podcasting is the ultimate long form.
Oh, and that's why I'm here. But I do know that if the barn burner guys talk about who the captain of the Calgary Flames should be, and I talk about Bill Peters getting hired in Lethbridge, nobody's tuning in for 4 hours of me about the problems in hockey right now. And again, it's those conversations. How do we have those important conversations? The entertainment stuff, I get it. And I endorse it. And I love it. Don't get me wrong. Like, Ariel Halawane, like he was doing 5-hour podcasts. He's been doing them for years, right?
And he does he actually is a good example of a independent case study. I mean, niche with UFC was way early on the UFC trend.
Yes.
Canadian guy, so love to plug a Canadian who's crushing it internationally. But I mean, I'll use his as an example that he toes the line between entertainment and also holding the UFC's feet to the fire. He does hold people accountable. Everyone from Dana to fighters to people being underpaid years ago in the UFC. Ariel Halawane is someone who does a really, really great job, I think, and people listen to him. People respect that he is someone who is, again, holding the sport and the management of MMA accountable. So, I mean, I would look at, let's use Rick Westhead as an example. I mean, if tomorrow TSN said, listen, we're just out of the news business entirely, Rick, we just can't support you anymore. I don't think Rick Westhead would be much smaller in 6 months' time. I think he could go and continue to have a voice. I think he could continue to do all the investigation that he's doing. I think people would pay for it. He could use things from podcasts, things like Substack. I think he could have people pay him directly for his reporting. I think he would have an audience and also have as much impact. There's a chance he'd have more impact. There's a chance that, we haven't seen him grow enough, and that being part of TSN actually is a bit of a conflict for him. I mean, I would give TSN a ton of credit. They've really let him run with Hockey Canada.
They really have. Yeah.
But, I'm sure that there's been some uncomfortable conversations between Hockey Canada, TSN, and Rick about, listen, we appreciate the journalism, but you also are our largest broadcasting partner. And we make a lot of money here on the World Junior Tournament. We make a lot of money promoting Hockey Canada. So what do we do here?
Well, I tell you what, you get the decision in this case because you made me feel more optimistic about this, because it was really easy to be pessimistic and go, well, it's all going away. But you've changed my mind, because obviously the examples that you've given, Ariel, and you're right. I think Rick would do that. And we need that. Like we need that. We need to encourage that. Right. I was really, lack of a better word, proud of Salim and help me out, Jack. Who was I pumping tires last week on from The Athletic? Julian McKenzie. Sorry,
Julian
I'm
McKenzie,
old.
yeah.
I'm old. Those two guys did an incredible job at that Lethbridge Hurricanes press conference with Bill Peters. Like that wasn't fanboy stuff. That was good old fashioned ask the hard questions and stuff like that. So I know it's still there.
I'm a big fan of Julian McKenzie. I actually think he's a great example of someone. I know he's in Calgary with The Athletic. He also co-hosts podcasts with CJ on the Steve Dangle Podcast Network. He's a good example of someone who is younger, who is still growing as a sports journalist, sports media person. I think I would love to know what his thoughts are on how he identifies. Does he see himself as a journalist? Because he, to me, feels like a great blend between traditional kind of old school hard hitting journalist and new media, understands how to reach a younger audience, understands the internet, and gets the kind of entertainment fandom piece of it as well.
I think he's had good mentorship. I think whoever has mentored him and given him the fundamentals for sure. Because he does, you're right, he does a great job co-hosting the podcast, but his work on the Bill Peters stuff and like I say, so him from TSN was good too. I don't want to, pick one over the other, but that gives me, some optimism, and this conversation gives me some optimism that the platforms are there. We just might not be able to, there's something about not having that Sunday paper, dude. I have not been the same since we've done away with a big, thick Sunday paper where I can take 3 or 4 hours and I can see what movies are coming and I can see what's going on in the stock market and all that stuff. My world's changed. And that's
habits are really hard to change. And
aren't they?
And I think there are a lot of people who still feel the same way as you. I mean, I feel, myself as, okay, I understand what's going on with media trends and I'm, embracing the new media world, but I have habits that I'm stuck with still that if they were to change, I mean, we talk about podcasts as being new. There's a lot of podcasts that I've listened to for close to 10 years now, and I have that same cadence. And if that podcast isn't published when I expect it to be, it throws me off, and I expect it to be published.
Yeah.
And that's my Sunday paper, and I think of it that way. So, there are definitely, new things that I'm not exploring yet, and that it takes a long time to change those habits.
Love it. Let's shift gears. The other tweet that you put out on Tuesday was your 3 mega trends now that we start into the fall. And I definitely want to talk about all of them. Let's start with the first one, which was sportsbooks promoting NFL is going to lead to increased content and viewership. Okay.
Yeah.
So flesh this out for me a bit.
Yeah. So mega trends to watch. This is really specific to the Canadian market. And so let's talk about the NFL. Talking to sportsbooks, I mean, this may not be a surprise to anyone, but it is by far the most wagered on sport. It's not even close. Even in Canada, where people say it's got to be hockey, not hockey. It's the NFL.
It is.
The NFL is number one in Canada for every single sportsbook. It's the thing that they care the most about. We're in a major arms race right now in Canada as sports betting is being legalized. So people in Ontario know it's been legal for a year. People in the rest of the country have seen way too many advertisements in between games about every single sports book under the sun. Last I checked, there's some 60 odd sports books operating in Canada right now, legally, a handful more still operating illegally. We expect regulation to happen in Alberta in the next year, expect BC in the next year and a half, Quebec sometime in the next year and a half. So legalized sports betting is not going anywhere. The NFL, again, being that kind of straw that stirs the drink for the apps, that's how they get people to place a wager, is the number one thing that they want to invest sponsorship dollars into. They want to create content around. So yes, TSN, turn it on today. You're going to see SportsCenter with Jay this morning. Long NFL segment with Luke Wilson talking about the lines for the game, but also just talking about that. That was partially editorial decision by TSN. They want to talk about the NFL. They know the NFL viewership's good. They make money on the NFL. But also, FanDuel, their biggest partner, is saying, listen, guys, part of our deal here is that in the mornings, you're talking about the NFL lines. And then the afternoons on Overdrive, we're talking about the NFL lines. We're driving people into the sports book for games. So content is being created to drive people to these sports books to place wagers, originally on the NFL, then maybe you find a hockey line, you find a tennis line, you find a casino, you do something on there. But the NFL is that like hook for a lot of people in. Now, we saw in the US as legalization happened, increase in viewership for games. And it follows. Same thing kind of happened during the fantasy sports boom. People start watching games that don't have players or teams that they care about in.
Right.
It's Thursday Night Football. I don't care about Mahomes or the Lions, but I'm a Bills fan, let's say. But you know what? It's Travis Kelce got injured. All of a sudden, the line moved a little bit. Might be worth placing a $20 bet down on the game. Now I got to watch my $20 bet. So the bet leads to viewership. The viewership leads to more investment from the media company saying, wow, people are watching this. We should create more NFL content. And this trend has already kind of come true a little bit. Sportsnet Radio in Toronto launched an NFL show. They don't even have the NFL rights. They launched a radio NFL show. I think it's called The Gridiron. And, that's something that historically I don't think Sportsnet would really spend much time on. They historically have not spent a lot of time on the NFL because it's not something that they broadcast. I've noticed this year they're spending a lot more time talking about NFL. Partially because I know they have sports books that want to advertise with them that want NFL content. Partially because they know that NFL is, growing in viewership and important for them. So it's this really symbiotic relationship between sports books, tell media company, go talk about the NFL because it's good for us. It drives people. Then people start watching more NFL because they're betting on it. NFL becomes bigger, so on and so forth. The cycle continues.
So two things that kind of come out of that. One would be the decision last week, which is not necessarily directly connected, and I mentioned it, would like your take on it, by the province of Ontario that now says celebrities can't endorse the online gambling. Are there hiccups coming? Are there hiccups in this? Is there something that we should be paying attention to when it comes to online sports wagering?
No, I actually think that this is like a much needed correction that I think, frankly, speaking to people who run these sports books, and speaking to people in the industry, everyone welcomes this regulation. I think it probably should have been there from the start,
Okay.
but we stumbled out of the gates a little bit in Ontario with our regulatory framework. There's no good reason for current athletes to be endorsing sportsbooks mid-game or at all.
Right.
And I think everyone from the current athletes, I think, might be a little upset to lose a few dollars, but they don't. Frankly, I'm sure they'd love to not have the option, so they don't need to turn down money or worry about the moral dilemma of it. Sportsbooks are more than happy to not pay Connor McDavid or Nathan McKinnon a bunch of money. We can find other people to be in our advertisements, and the leagues kind of get rid of the question around the kind of the moral ambiguity of having
Gotcha.
Mitch Marner or Connor McDavid or Austin Matthews promoting things. I don't think that this is going to be as big a stumble, and we've already seen in the U.S. is already the case, right? So the NBA has already had very strict rules. Current players cannot endorse sportsbooks in the NBA. The only reason the NHL didn't have as clear rules is because there's so many European players in the NHL where sports betting be legal for a long time. The likes of Matt Sundin and other Swedish players, were saying to the PA, listen, I'm being offered a lot of money back home in Sweden to go be an endorser for Leo Vegas or for, any number of European sportsbook.
Sure.
I should be able to do that, and the NHL allowed it because, gambling was illegal in the US, but
Mhm.
it was not really their role to fight the PA on guys making money off the ice. So
Gotcha.
I think retired athletes, celebrity, that's going to probably be written out of this regulation, to be honest. I don't think that the AGCO or any regulatory body should be telling a former athlete that they can't go have a secondary career. I think it creates a whole myriad of problems. Celebrity is a term that I think is impossible to define, and I don't think the AGCO wants to get in the business of defining it. You can't tell a guy that played one game in the AHL, is he a former NHL player? He got called up for a game, skated for a few minutes. Now he can't, be on a podcast that's hosted by MGM. I don't think so. So that's probably going to go away as part of this regulation, but current athletes will stick around.
The other part in the previous answer you were talking about was, you're not a Lions fan or a Chiefs fan, but, you get brought into the game. I was under the impression that was part of the NHL strategy, that the in-game betting would, they felt might drive viewership too, that, those Columbus games on a Tuesday night that, we just happen to have on the network, sports wagering might actually help them. Have we seen that? Has that worked? Does that theory work?
Yeah. So it's worked definitely. Last year in the US, there was an uptick in NFL ratings, and people were attributing some of that to sports betting. The attribution on this is always a little bit, hard to define. But I think that very much that is the case. I do think that having another reason to watch, same way we had with fantasy. I mean, fantasy was a thing that, and the leagues are always behind the eight ball on this. The leagues hated fantasy. They hated fantasy. Why are people cheering for players? They should be cheering for teams. The teams all hated fantasy till they found out, oh man, we can create all this content around fantasy. NFL Network does a ton of fantasy stuff. NHL Network now does a ton of fantasy stuff. They realized that people start tuning in because they wanted to see their fantasy players score. Sports betting is the same thing. They didn't want anything to do with sports betting. It ruins the game. They're seeing now that it gives the people a reason to tune in. It's another storyline to think and talk about. And I suspect that we will see an uptick in, not to bury Columbus. Columbus is always the boy here, but the out of market Tuesday night non-playoff team matchup. I think that those are the games where you will see an increase in interest, an increase in following, an increase in viewership, and, an increase in importance for those games.
Your second mega trend here in Canada, sports podcasts hit the mainstream with tier one sponsors shifting ad dollars. I think one of my favorite tweets that you put out every week is the top spenders in radio advertising. I'm always fascinated, even today, by who's spending what. But you think some of that money is going to transfer into the podcast world? Is now transferring into the podcast world?
Yeah, listen, Rob, I'll play a game with you for a second.
Sure.
In Toronto, big market. There's, in the greater Toronto area, there's a few million folks. Numeris, which is the ratings organization, has the all population of Toronto, the way that they define Toronto, as 6.5 million people.
Yep.
The way that the ratings work for radio is they use a sample. Your audience will probably know that they don't measure every single radio broadcast. They can't possibly do that. They don't know what you're listening to in your car or at home. What they do is they use a sample, same way like a political poll would, to extrapolate off that 6.5 million. Guess how many people are in Numeris' sample for 6.5 million Torontonians?
2,000.
As of this is a year old now, and there's been reports that the sample actually is shrunk since then, although I haven't been able to confirm a new number. But this time last year, 1,300 people were in. Now, no advertisement buy in the history of time has been against all people. People buy adults 18 to 24. People buy men 25 to 54. I want to reach, people that are in the market for a car. So you look at adults 25 to 54, 70% of all radio ad dollars in Canada are bought against adults 25 to 54. It is essentially just means adults who have money. They're not so old that they're in that kind of retirement age and they're already set with their brands. These are people who need to buy their first car, get their first mortgage, get their first house. This is like the number one consumer. They have young kids. These are people who spend money. Adults 25 to 54. In Toronto, the sample for that population is only 500 people. So 500 people are determining hundreds of millions of ad dollars in Toronto still. There's still, I don't know if we're hundreds still in Toronto. We might be 100 in Toronto now, but at a time, hundreds of millions in Toronto. Across the country, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars actually in advertising against a sample. Numeris' entire country sample for radio. And by the way, this is true for television as well. Less than 10,000 people across all of Canada for 40 million. So, going back to my mega trend, it's been obvious for a long time that the same way Netflix is a better way to watch a television show on demand, a podcast is a better way to consume sports talk content. It just is. Yep. It's delivered easier. It's coast to coast. And you actually know how many people listen to it. And not only do you know how many people downloaded it, you know how long they listen to, you know who they are, you have their social following. You can also reach them via a number of other ways. They maybe visit your website. So there's so many other ways to interact with a consumer on a podcast compared to traditional media. It is a no-brainer for advertisers to move there. Now, advertisers move really slow. It's probably been a no-brainer for 5 years, but the advertising industry has slowly moved into podcast. But the way these things usually go is very slowly and then all at once. And I think that this year, my kind of prediction for the year is we're going to have the all-at-once moment. We have, too many eyeballs and too many listeners going to podcasts. We also have too many talented broadcasters leaving traditional media and going to podcasting. We have too many producers, behind the scenes people leaving traditional media, going there, that one of these days, Harvey's and McDonald's and Ford wake up, and this is already happening, and say, I just cannot continue cutting those giant checks for the 500 person sample. I just can't do it. I got to find somewhere else.
That's insane. I wish number 3 was a little bit more positive for friends of mine, but I'm not surprised. You think that we're going to see more cuts at TSN and Sportsnet?
Yeah, and this is not like a fun prediction or trend to watch, but I do think that this is kind of the continued trend. I don't, by all accounts, on-air talent at both the broadcast companies have been told that they are in their seats till the end of the year. That's what I've heard kind of behind the scenes. They always say that. So I don't know, take that with a grain of salt. No one tells you, oh, by the way, you're getting fired in 6 months, right? Everyone says, oh, don't worry.
Rogers
good to go.
Rogers did that a couple years ago.
Well, they did. You're right.
Yeah, but...
which I've never understood why you do that. So, I think that some of the cuts and a lot of the cuts will actually be, the machine behind the machine. And a lot of, I think, consumers don't realize that there are thousands of jobs to run radio stations, to run newsrooms, to run broadcasts. There are a lot of people from sales to design. Think about all the graphics that you see to keep a website or a TV station or a radio station running all day. There are so many of those jobs, and automation has been the name of the game in all of those roles. And I think we'll continue to cut. Sportsnet and TSN are, 2 cable channels within a larger bundle of cable for both these networks, which are owned by a larger telco, Sportsnet being now part of the biggest Rogers Shaw merger telco. It is no longer an important line item on their public reporting, what's going on with their TV station. TSN used to be something that in the Bell earnings call, they could say, oh, and TSN, ripped us off another X hundreds of millions of dollars in profit this year. What an amazing asset that is. It is now hey, we're innovating, we're pivoting to digital. It's not a liability. Trust us. It's not a liability. So these sports networks have gone from really big assets to potential liabilities. And I think that the kind of sharp pencils at both those companies will be looking for ways to ensure that the bottom line, ensure that they're not money losing. You cannot be losing money on those or they'll just go away.
The kind of the anti-story or the flip side to that, I guess, would be the launch this week at 1440 in Edmonton. That, after all of these years of talking about cuts and everything. Now we have one coming back into the marketplace, which is very interesting.
Absolutely. And I've maintained that, cuts are a result of the way Canada aggregated all of its media into 4 companies. And we're debundling it all. It's not pretty, and it's never pretty when you debundle everything, and no one can disrupt themselves. But there is as much demand as ever for sports talk content. So I think, listen, 1440, phenomenal example in Edmonton. It is an interesting model, right? It is a hybrid digital and video and podcast and radio. There are, I just know from behind the scenes, it's a lot less of a corporate structure where, hey, you're the talent, you're on air, here's your salary, you do this many shows a year for us, we pay you this. It is a true partnership between people who are on air, people who are behind the scenes, people who are selling ads, people who are consuming. It is a more modern approach to a media company. And you know what? Radio is a part of that. There's nothing wrong with having radio be part of the signal. I actually really love radio. I think there's a lot of great stuff for radio. I actually really love TV too. I just think that you need to have this kind of holistic approach to distribution and media in order for it to work. You saw with Sportsnet in Vancouver, Donnie and Dolly were let go from the Sportsnet station. They went out on their own. They got to deal with Czech. They were on air with Czech. They're now being syndicated back onto the radio station just a few years later, right? They still have their own show. They're still doing the TV, but they're back on the radio station. So there are so many different kind of optimistic stories happening. I mentioned the La Poche Blue story. I mean, that's a company that Playmaker acquired earlier this year. Incredible company based in Quebec. Maxime and Guillaume. If it was 10 years ago that they had retired and wanted to get in media, TVA or RDS would have said, okay, you guys can be on the panel for the Habs games and we'll pay you this and you guys are talent. Instead, they said, forget that. We see what Barstool does with Splitting Chicklets, or we see what Part of My Take is like, or we see what the Nation Network's doing with Oilers Nation. We can do our own thing. So they did their own thing. They built a media company. They are now bigger than any of the sports radio shows in that market in Quebec. They are superstars there, and they distribute the show on YouTube. They also distribute it on Cogeco Radio across the province. They also do live events. They do so many different ways. But it's still sports talk content. At the end of the day, they're talking about who's going to be on the Habs second line. It truly is the same stuff, but just a different distribution mechanism and different incentives for the creators involved, where they are much more involved in every piece of building the audience, of maintaining the audience and growing it to, the legacy media companies. And Rob, you know this.
I do.
It was impossible to know who was listening to your show. Even the ratings that did exist, even that 500-person sample, they never told the on-air talent, what the ratings looked like or why the advertising deals were up or down that day. Bob McCowan to Brian Hayes to James Duthie, they weren't involved with going out and pitching Budweiser or Ford or being part of the program. They were just, hey, you're on-air talent. You worry about the talent. Let us worry about everything else. And I just don't think that works anymore.
No, I don't, and I like your terminology, modern approach, because I agree. I'm excited about what this could be, and I'm hoping that it's going to get, I don't know what it needs to take. Maybe it needs to take the big two to get out of it and let the smaller radio stations take that and run with it.
I think it requires, Rob, just more people like everyone at 1440, and it was a joint partnership between a number of different people. I think it's people like what Adam Wilde and Steve Dangle have done in Toronto. Both of them have left their full-time media jobs to do their podcast network on their own. And I will tell you that they are not doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. They're doing it because they think that this is how they're going to grow their audience, and that there's revenue attached to it. I mean, it needs to be a viable business, and I do think that there's a lot of people who think that there is a viable business to be had on the internet, digitally distributed, and across Canada. You do not need to be part of a larger media co. You can do it yourself.
I love this. I really appreciate you coming on. The best part for me is I always learn something, and it always tests my theories, and I like that. I like my theories to be tested, and today I'm happy to be wrong about stuff. So that was awesome, Adam. I appreciate you coming on. Again, one of the must follows for me on social, because I'm always fascinated by who's buying radio.
I will keep you posted on who is buying radio. And the last thing I will say before I jump off here is that I wanted just to plug Gregory Strong's story. Canadian Press got the Rogers on record saying that they are not going to be sending the Jays broadcast on the road for the radio. I just wanted to kind of give a shout out. Great reporting there by Gregory, and I think, frankly, it's a bit of an embarrassment. I mean,
it's a complete embarrassment. It's
as much as we say that radio is dying and the sample size is small and all that kind of stuff. You communicate to your players, to your fans, to everyone that the team is not a big league team and that it's not important to you to have a quality product on the air.
I agree.
And this would never happen if the team was not owned by the same company that broadcasts the games.
I agree.
It's just that easy. If a private individual owned the game, you'd say, sorry, guys, we have a radio broadcast deal. The deal says you got to send the guys on the road. And if you won't do it, I'm going to go take it to the competitor radio station. And that doesn't happen when you're vertically integrated. So,
nope.
Anyways, it's a real shame for Jays fans. And hopefully over the next couple of weeks, they have something to cheer for. And we're going to lament not having Ben Wagner on the road because they're going to be winning so many games.
That's a hope. That's a hope. As a former Expos fan, that's a hope. That's all I would say. That's a hope. Thanks, Adam. I appreciate this.
All right. Thanks, Rob.
Adam Seaborn, everybody, sports media analyst and the head of partnerships at Playmaker Capital. Playmaker Capital owns the Nation Network, which we are proud to be on. Of course, brought to you by Ski Cellar Snowboard, skicellarsnowboard.com. 77 years. Can you believe it? 77 years in Calgary. They're back open 3 locations right now. McLeod Trail by Chinook Center, 17th Avenue Southwest, just off of 14th Street, and Bow Ridge Road Northwest. Go in, check them out. The snow's not coming yet, but it's coming, and you want to be ready. And when you are, I mean, it's going to happen there first. It's just going to snow in the mountains before it snows on us. So we got that going for us. Check them out online, skicellarsnowboard.com, Ski Cellar Snowboard. Jack, do we have some questions in the comments? I didn't seed it today, but have you been watching?
Yeah, we've got a couple questions. I actually have a question myself.
Please.
So in the radio business,
yes,
that was a very interesting conversation between you guys. How did you guys pitch to sponsors? What numbers were you getting? How did you get those numbers?
Well, we got the numbers from, Numeris or I'm not sure. Again, he's right. Like, they didn't spend a lot of time with us, the on-air talent, and talk about it. But people meters were another thing. So it used to be, just to give you a little history, used to be, ratings in the past, they mail you a book. And you were asked to write into the book what you were listening or watching in half-hour increments. Then something called the people meter came, and the people meter was something that you wore on your belt, and you walked around with it, and it just picked up the thing. So lots of different ways of measuring it. Particularly sports radio was always mails. They always sell mails. They always sold, on peaks and things like that. Always discounted the summer book. Always looked at the fall book and the winter books as being the important books. That's when hockey was on. That's when things were, things were at their best. It's funny, and I get into this about the rebuilds. You know how all the time I'm kind of down on rebuilds. Mm-hmm. Part of that is because every part of this business that I've been into always does better with the team in the playoffs, regardless of whether they win or lose. But if they're in the playoffs, things spike, things go up, and then you can sell on those numbers. So the story that I loved the most was during the 2004 run when Calgary went to the Stanley Cup final. We had a car dealership, and we were asking the car dealership to check the radios as they were coming in to get fixed. And we were 75% of vehicles were tuned to the radio station. So yeah, towards the end of my radio career, we were starting to go out with salespeople, and I always would. I had no problem. But I think part of it too is they did want to protect us from the kind of the business part of it. Mm-hmm. But it's a different world today. It is a completely different world today. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay.
We'll move on to the first question here from Walshy.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the Labor Day Classic being played in the smoke, and will the Stamps win?
Whoa. Week? So thanks. I like that question. Why did you bother setting a level if you weren't prepared to live with it? So I don't know if everybody knows this, but whatever the air quality was, the game was supposed to be postponed at 7, and I believe the air quality was 9. And so they played the game. They got the game in, and then this week they've agreed that an independent, not an arbitrator, but an independent group will measure the smoke quality, the air quality. You know what? I'm again, if you set a rule, you set a rule. How difficult it would have been to move the game to Tuesday or do whatever, or scheduling, I get it, but that's a health and safety thing. And, it's difficult when you're asking fans. It's still a gate-driven league. When you're asking fans to come out in difficult conditions, it was wet that day too. I don't think it rained during the game, but it was wet that day. The CFL's had a really, I don't know about you, Jack, but the credibility of the league has taken some real body blows. The stats, not being updated, and then the health and safety thing like this. You always get into the credibility of the league when you get into player punishment and things like that. But his point is a good. What was the second part of that question?
Well, the stamps. I actually wanted to bring up, like, that was so interesting that I found that in Canada, the highest bet on sport is the NFL.
You were shocked by that?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm not. It's a lot of things, but it's the perfect formula of an event every week.
Yeah.
The stars are the stars. There's lots of information. We have access because of these things and our phones to all kinds of information on it. It's long traditionally been I think the backbone of the sports gambling industry, even when it was illegal. So no, that didn't surprise me at all. The hockey one, I think ProLine and that kind of gave us that false sense, because I think hockey was always big for ProLine, but I anticipated second in the country, but no, I'm not surprised. But you're surprised it was an NFL, eh?
Yeah.
You thought hockey ahead of it?
I definitely thought hockey, yeah. There's just more games. But like you said, I guess the NFL, it is an event, and all my friends are doing it. Fantasy, betting on the weekend is just something to look forward to. So I think
it's great. It's funny, we were talking to Adam about, investigative journalism. The NFL really went through I believe it was the Ray Rice and then the concussions, and then there's this, all these articles being written on the health and the safety of the game, and the game really seemed kind of under fire. And that's where that term, if you invented it today, it would be illegal. That's where that idea came from. And then bloop, like fantasy blew up because of the internet, I think, and the access to it. And then sports gambling, I go back to 2018. I remember when that announcement was made, and I remember coming on the radio going, this is a freaking game changer. Like, our worlds are about to change. And I know people were like, what do you mean? And I think in the 5 years or whatever it's been since that decision was made, the world has changed. It's just the valuation on the teams, it's incredible. And to the point, that Adam made, do I like Detroit? Nope. Do I like Kansas City? Nope. But Kelsey's out and Jones isn't playing. Geez, that moves the line. Okay, now I'm interested. And if I got money on it, I'm going to watch it. I know the CFL would love to mimic it. I think the NHL would love to mimic it. I think baseball would love to mimic. I just don't know how you do.
Yeah, I don't think it's possible. I think the players carry that league. Like, you're so invested in every single player, and it's through fantasy, it's through betting. Most people can't name players on the Calgary Flames. All these NFL stars.
Yes, I think, and again, this gets into a whole different conversation, but we just assumed that everybody was going to grow up as a hockey fan in this country. And I think if not for the internet, and if not for the access to this information, they would have. But now, it's glossy, it's glitzy, it's Hollywood, really. Of the sports, it's Hollywood, right? Yep. It has that feel. The CFL's earthy, it's us. It feels like us. It's a working man sport. The NHL is it's a good sport, it's a great sport, but it's a Canadian sport. But the NFL, no, the NFL just feels like Hollywood to me. And what was it? Sorry, the last part of his question was, do
you think the Stamps will they play the Eskimos?
They play the Eskimos tomorrow up in Edmonton. Edmonton's finally won at home after 4 years of not winning. I hope so. I don't know how I can go, wow, they've solved everything. Watching the first half of that game against Labor Day, it's like they just cannot score. Now the second half, they found a way to find the end of the end zone. And Edmonton only has 2 wins on the season. They can. I'm not. If you're asking me if I'm going to wager on that game, no, I'm not taking them. They can win it for sure, but they have done nothing to give me confidence that they can string 2 games back to back, win this game, and then the next one is going to be a different result for me.
Another thing I wanted to bring up,
Yeah.
I haven't watched a CFL game in years.
Mhm.
Trey Ford had me watching football when the Stamps played last week.
It's always that's the missing ingredient for the CFL is when it was at its height, when it's at its popularity, there are characters, there are people. My experience in this city was when it was at its height, when it was its popularity, Henry Burris was always on the radio. Nick Lewis was always on the radio. There was space for them. There was places for them. But, like Adam said, there's more people that want to listen to fantasy football now that want to hear about it. But you need to find a way to get a Trey Ford in front of people, right? If you see him, then you go, yeah, I can. And that was the beauty of, I thought, of Henry Burris and of Nick Lewis and Jermaine Copeland and all of those guys for a period of time there. They were everywhere. They did everything. They never said no. They were always on the radio. They elevated the profile of the sport. I contend, and I could be proven wrong, that, when Huffnagel came in, they weren't as readily available anymore. And things changed. And I'm not blaming John Huffnagel for that. I'm just saying that, Huffnagel came in and he made some changes, and, the players weren't just as, free to be on the air and those types of things as they were in the past. That's, but that's not an Edmonton thing or a Winnipeg thing or a Saskatchewan thing. I think the same thing, I think people in Winnipeg right now probably know that team really good, right? They know who those players are. So, yeah, I agree with you. A guy like Trey Ford but he has to now be everywhere. Like, you got to be talking about him all the time, right?
Mm-hmm. Next question here. Who do you think should pick the captain of the Flames? The coaches, players, Conroys, fans?
Yes, a fan poll. I think your leader, I think you have a leadership group, whether you know it or not. I think you have guys, Chris Tanev steps to mind, Backlund steps to mind, Uyghur steps to mind. I think there's guys that, regardless of whether or not they were wearing the C, I think that the coaching staff will know who they are. I think the general manager has been the captain of this team. His assistant has been the captain of this team. I think you come together as a group. And I think part of it, though, is what does the coach and what does the general manager want the captain to do? We had Brett Sutter on last week, and Brett's been a coach in so many different locations. And, what's the role of the captain here? Is the role of the captain, if you're going to be a young team, is the role of the captain to integrate them into the lineup and teach them the way, and this is how we carry ourselves? Is the captain on this team need to be the voice of the players to the coach? Mike Keenan famously went to Owen Nolan when he was briefly here in Calgary to see if the team should practice or not. That's who he was comfortable with. That's the voice that he chose. So I don't want to cop out here. The one group I would take out is no, that won't be the fans. But I think your veteran players, your leaders in that locker room, your coach and your general manager have all got to come together and figure out what that role is going to be, what they want from that role, and then who best serves that role.
I agree.
Okay.
Last one here.
Sure.
Do you have a Super Bowl pick, or is it too early?
Do I have a Super Bowl pick?
Yeah.
No, it's not too early. This is what I've always hated the prediction, and we had to do them one time where you had to write them out and they had to go in the paper and all that stuff. I hate making predictions, but I don't mind with the NFL because I don't have a horse in the race. Joe Burrow got paid yesterday. Joe Burrow got paid yesterday, becomes the highest paid player in the NFL. I admit I've really enjoyed watching Joe Burrow the last couple of years in Cincinnati. He's relatable. I just like the way that he plays and carries himself. I guess if I had to go out on a limb, I'll take Cincinnati. I think they've been knocking on the door. I don't think they're your odds-on favorite. I don't think they're your top favorite, but yeah, I'll go with Cincinnati. Who do you like?
I think I'm going to go Philly here.
I could be convinced.
The NFC just seems a lot more open. Like you look at the AFC, the Jets, the
Yeah.
Bengals, the Ravens, the Chiefs.
Well, the Jets have to prove it.
Yeah, they do. But
The Jets have to prove it. But I agree. The team that lost last night's still going to be a good team once they get their players back, right?
Yeah,
They're going to be a really
100%.
good team. And you and I both know this is an injury league. And by that, if Joe Burrow gets carted off after game 1, there you go. But if I'm picking preseason, let's go with the Bengals. Sure.
Let's do it. Okay.
All right.
That is it.
Before we leave NFL, can we show that little clip?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So this is both the most exciting and scariest thing I have ever seen. We talked a little bit about technology, and we talked about, the things that need to be in new buildings and stuff like that. Front Office News had this one on their site today. So if you're a Dallas Cowboys fan, you can take this tour, and then you get to meet an AI version of Jerry Jones. So this is fans meeting not the real, but it sure seems real Jerry Jones.
And I headed back to Dallas, and within a matter of weeks, I'd bought the Dallas Cowboys.
Why did you choose AT&T to be your naming rights partner?
The reason AT&T Stadium is AT&T Stadium is because, to me, AT&T was like saying America. And I wanted our Dallas Cowboys, America's team, to be associated with Alexander Graham Bell and AT&T.
Yeah. So that's not Jerry Jones. That's his AI counterpart. So does that mean no more, so the fans won't ever get real owners anymore? Now they're only going to get the AI version of the owners? That it's cool. Technology's flawless, Jack. Scares the hell out of me.
That is scary. Red actually brought up something really interesting the other day. He was like, what if we could have AI voices, like Peter Marr AI, he calls the Flames games on the radio.
Yep.
That will be insane.
Yep.
I think video games will probably dive into that a little bit, where you
Yep.
can have different announcers for different games instead of just the 2 guys that they have every year. I thought
but that's that whole strike with the writers right now.
Yeah.
Is that's what they've been saying, is that the technology's to a point now where we're really close to bringing John Wayne back.
Yeah.
Or whatever. Who owns his voice? Who owns his rights to his voice? Your example is a good one. And I'm watching that going, do teams think it's good enough if they just have an AI version? Here's an AI version of the coach, AI version of the general manager, AI version of the owner. Go talk to him. Yeah. It's crazy, isn't it? All right. Final mile before we go here. Congratulations to 2 friends of the program. We'll start first. U.S. Hockey Hall of Famer Brian Burke. Brian Burke, I'm a little surprised, to be perfectly honest, that he's not in the U.S. Hockey Hall of Fame. He is a Stanley Cup champion with his time in Anaheim. He has also worked on Olympic teams and won medals in Olympics programs, is now working with the players of the Professional Women's Hockey Association, former senior advisor here, and still to this day puts his name on the Targets for Kids sport. Truly, what you see is what you get when it comes to Brian Burke, and so happy for Berkey to get that recognition by the United States Hockey Hall of Fame. And how about this? Not what I was expecting, but man, does this make sense on so many levels. The Calgary Flames announcing some new additions to hockey operations. I'll draw your attention to the middle. Peter Labardius, reserve list scout. Lubo, who was on this show not that long ago, has been added to Craig Conroy's staff. So the reserve list scout, the reserve list of the players that you've drafted that are on your list. So he will be scouting the players that and keeping track of the players that the Flames have drafted. But I would also imagine that he'd probably be paying attention to other people's reserve lists as well. But don't think that this is some sort of charitable, oh, isn't that cute kind of thing. Lou's worked as a scout before, worked for the Red Deer Rebels as a scout before, but anybody who spent any time with Lou in an arena knows that the hockey people come and talk to him, that he is trusted for his ability to evaluate talent. He's earned that as a broadcaster. He's earned that with his enthusiasm for junior hockey and going to those buildings and being in those buildings and knowing the people that he knows. So this is not a token piece that Craig Conroy has done here. This is a hell of a pickup, and I'm really excited for Lou. Texted him today, congratulated him. I just think it's fantastic. So maybe next show what we'll do is we'll try and come up with jobs for other people in the media. I don't know. Anyway, I'm just so proud of my pal Lou, and I know he's going to do a great job. We're back on Monday. Guest to be determined. Same thing next Friday. Guest to be determined. But Wednesday's show, back to 3 days a week starting in October. Barn Burner is back full on. Beginning on, or not beginning, but Monday through Friday as well, live from the 55. I mean, we got a lot going on here, and Jack's right at the helm of it. So thanks to him, thanks to you, thanks to Adam Seaborn, our guest. We'll see you on Monday. Have a great weekend, everybody.
When there's two